Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye are like unto whited sepulchres, which outwardly appear beautiful, but inwardly are full of dead men's bones, and of all uncleanness. Matthew 23:27, English Revised Version, Tuel, the Aztec name for gods when confronted by Cortez on horseback, Brad? He called to the captain. Where exactly are we going? I could leave a message for Rod to join us. Brad's tactful smile faded and came back instantly. His right eyebrow arched beneath the new tactful smile. Hey, Simon, I wish I could tell you more than I know, but all I know is we are going to a rancho. Some American rich guy thinks we got a fine vessel here and wants to celebrate our coming in and setting anchor. How are we getting to the rancho? Hell, I don't know, probably a limousine? I really don't know, but it's a small town, and I'm sure they will find us on the boat here. Brad's eyes squinted, and his smile broadened as two black Land Rovers pulled up to the landing beach with one tapping his horn twice. Brad raised his arm and waved. Here we go, boys, first class all the way. Let's get ashore and party, Brad yelled out. Everybody responded with whoops, except Simon, who bit his lip looking along the beach strand from one end to the other, but it was empty of anybody. He followed them over the rail, looking up and down the beach as he gained the dinghy, and placed his oars and pushed off. A tall, ornate gate opened at their arrival and closed at their passing. Simon could see two men in dark guayabara shirts and dark shorts standing and looking at the dust of the vehicles in them. The main house was a sprawling site of pale whitewash, arches and red, tiled roofs. It seemed set into the jungle, but had nothing planted at its front. There was no driveway, just a dusty ending to the entrance road. As they rolled out of the Land Rovers, Simon could see around the edges of the buildings and through some of the arches that there was no jungle, merely a field on both sides after a fern facade of wavy grasses and a few acacia trees. In the distance was a real jungle. He stood there wondering at the landscape concept until Brad boomed in a cheery pronouncement. Better in Velada, boys. And that was the signal to enter. So they all started walking toward an arch, following two men who were also in dark guayabara shirts and dark shorts. They were tough-looking with shaved heads and thick necks. Simon could not tell what nationality they were, since they all seemed to have well-tanned browns in their colorings. The men did not say a word, but led the crew with smiling, friendly faces and hand gestures. Simon was imagining them using their obvious muscle that seemed violently intense under the loose shirts. The crew moved gently through a spacious open entrance hall into a large gardened area. A large, round, three-tiered fountain softly sprayed water from a simple ball at its head and trickled a steady flow of whooshing sounds over each tier to end in gurgling bass. The air was cooler as they passed with snickers and mumblings. On the other side of the fountain, and to each side of a long aqua-watered swimming pool, were small cottages, framed by little palm gardens with two lounging chairs, and one of those was occupied by a darkly tanned body with long dark hair hanging and dark sunglasses reflecting the sun. Music started up. Bob Marley was singing Buffalo Soldier, and the bodies all rose to dance their ways toward the sailors. The crew had open mouths. Even Simon. "Welcome, noble mariners." A very well-dressed man with a half-smile spoke from their right side. He also wore the guayabara shirt and dark shorts, but was holding a martini glass with liquid slightly moving. "I hope you enjoy yourselves." He turned and called out, "Play the Fingers of Mystery for our friends Ramon." Simon did not believe the man was American by his slightly detectable accent and the aristocratic way that he held himself. His hair was closely cropped and seemed to lay upon his head, its color almost the same as his skin. The man was watching the crew taking drinks from a silver tray offered by one of the finely featured women, and his smile grew higher on the side of his face, forcing his right cheek to protrude a bit. As Simon sipped his mezcal, his eyes met the man's eyes. The man smiled even more deeply as the hazel of his eyes grew faint. The man turned his head slowly and inclined his head behind one of the cottages toward a large, incongruously placed empty pig pen. Simon felt bumped and looked over at Brad. How sloppy, he thought, looking at his captain's whiskers clumped with muck, skin pale and twitching. Simon was smart. He got to the mud pool first and was not about to move over even for Brad. He would just ignore him. Simon shut his eyes, feeling Brad's pressured weight trying to move him. Brad looked down at the mud. "Sorry." He looked up as the man passed. The man stopped and turned. "What'd you say?" He was rough-looking, with a salt and pepper beard laying on his chest. His dark derby was too big for his head and came down to the eyebrows. His right hand was on the handle of his gun, and his eyes looked dazed. "I said sorry for bumping you. I was looking at my guns." Brad smiled, his warmest smile. "Draw, motherfucker." "What?" "You heard me, you wiggling bitch dog." The man began pulling his gun out of his holster, but still had the strap around the hammer. He was fumbling with the strap when a bullet tore into his chest, making a hole in the 2 shirts he wore and pushing him back a few steps. He looked up at Brad down at the hole, then fumbled again with the strap and fell forward at Brad's feet, showing a big hole in his back. Brad turned around to see a scraggly-haired blonde woman in baggy trousers and a bright red shirt levering another round into her Winchester rifle. She smiled at Brad, inclining her head for him to move over. Brad moved 2 steps to his right. She shot the downed man in his derby, and parts of his scalp blew onto the boardwalk. She yelled to Brad, "You mine now, girlie." Brad looked around. A crowd was spilling out onto the street heading for him. Brad was pushed and shoved down the street by the mob. Awaiting was a hangman's scaffold of old wood. A few withered floral wreaths were being touched by a faint breeze under the framework. The crowd stopped in front of it with grumblings and dull cheers. A man set up a small stand on wheels to the side of the scaffold and was selling hot wieners rolled in tortillas. Men and women were waiting, drinking from bottles and mugs. The hot wieners sold out fast, and the man took off his dirty apron, pulled his bowler hat down over his left eye, and smiled gaping teeth to the crowd. Shoved slightly to the side, Brad saw a bearded face, upside down, draped on the broad shoulder of a giant of a man dressed in a dark woolen suit. Brad wondered how he had his clothes made. The upside-down face draped down the man's shoulder was half covered with blood, mixed into a stiff and uplifted salt and pepper beard. He had very yellow teeth. Somebody in front of the giant was also carrying the corpse and lifted his legs to pass 2 older ladies who were smiling at the body and nodding gaily. The body was passed up to 3 men kneeling on the scaffolding who pulled it up and lay it prone. They stood looking down at the body and discussed something. Then one turned and untied the hangman's noose line from a metal cleat on the upright, while another pulled the noose down to the head of the dead man. The third lifted the man's head and helped getting the noose around and down to the neck. They both were pulling and maneuvering the noose under the man's long beard. Finally satisfied, all 3 took the line and pulled the man to an upright position. The first one retied the line. The dead man was now in a sitting position, with his head bent awkwardly to make his face look toward the heavens. The scraggly-haired blonde woman ran up the steps on the side of the scaffold with her hands raised, rifle in her right one, smiling and bowing her head in short nods to a cheering crowd. They escalated their cheering and whistling when she stood in a proud pose of hands on hips and rifle crossed behind her spread buckskin trousers. Brad, caught up in the celebration, looking at the elation in the crowd, found himself laughing at the triumph. He looked at the woman again, who was standing directly over the body in her pose, and started yelling yays. The blonde raised a long knife in the air with her left hand, and the crowd quieted to silence. She knelt gently on one knee and lowered her rifle to the platform. She dramatically shifted the knife to her right hand. Brad looked around at the smiling expectancy running across the faces of those nearest. She pointed the knife out to the crowd, who were now completely silenced. The woman pushed back her hair from her face as she surveyed the prone man. A light breeze blew the hairs back over her face. Her shoulder twisted as the knife went low and was buried in the dead man's clothing. She looked at its place, and her arms moved, one holding the body steady, the other twisting and turning in short movements. She looked up and out at the crowd. licking her lips and smiling. With one coordinated movement, she pushed his body off the scaffolding and rose with a handful of material that fell away to reveal a penis with hairy balls attached. Brad's mouth dropped open as the crowd began laughing and screaming and moving forward toward the slowly rotating body. They all seemed to have knives out. Even the two older ladies held long blades up in the air. The scraggly-haired woman had the penis in her mouth and bit hard. Brad turned away, feeling as though his stomach was being pulled out. He was held in place and could not turn completely around. The crowd was steadily moving forward, and he was pressured toward the scaffolding, but would not look up. Just down at shoes, boots, and trousers. An elbow jabbed Brad's shoulder as one of the men holding him broke free and tried to jump into a vacated spot ahead of them. Brad saw people cutting small sections of the now naked torso that flowed with blood and hung with organs. It turned, stopped, jiggled, turned, stopped, jiggled, with hands reaching and holding and knives striking, sticking, and sawing, slicing and gouging at chunks of him. Brad's stomach reacted, vomiting yellow bile onto his boots. Laughter echoed around him as he retched again and again until the dry heaves left him hiccuping horrible odors, paralleling the blood, flesh, guts, and excrement smells facing his cast-down eyes. He had been moved to the corpse and was standing in a purple, black, red, and fleshy pool of what was once a person. The body touched the top of his head. He wanted to faint. The blonde turned him and stood in front, toe to toe. He roamed up her buckskin, form lingering at creases in what was obviously a sensuous woman, and into her sparkling blue eyes. She was smiling and saying something. Then she screwed up her pixie face with crushed brows of worry and grabbed his arm, pulling him to the side of the scaffolding and past the stairs. The town whirled by in bright sunlight and deep shadow, creaking stairs and a shining doorknob. There were rushes of feelings, laughing, cries, wet then dry, then soft splashes. The water was cloudy and smelled of sulfur. Brad's knees were bare islets. He moved them, and the water of their wakes splashed softly against the copper sides of a deep tub. He willed his hands to cap his knees, and they did. A crack of floor moved his eyes around a lamplit room. The ceiling lamps were double-wicked and bright, just underglowing the light of the two on the wall fixed between two windows of outside night. Another lit lamp stood on a table next to a bed against another wall. A hand touched Brad's left shoulder. Another's hair caressed his own hair. Brad turned his head around and up to her, smiling down at him. She was naked and pale where her clothes covered, almost brown on hands and face. Her blonde hair wore white highlights and flickered gold from a ceiling lamp of 3 globes, hanging behind her from a dark beam holding a white ceiling. The words flowed through the water to him. "You are so wonderful. I am so lucky to have you." Brad worried thought into place. He wasn't a pig. He owned guns. She shot a man who wanted to shoot him. He stopped and looked around, finding his clothes neatly hanging next to her clothes on wooden clothes hooks next to a door. Their boots were strewn beneath them. Several guns in holsters, knives, and a rifle lay in a pile next to the bed near the door and in shadows of the lighting. "You looking at the bed? You want to fuck some more? Damn." Her words were somehow comforting, like his mother's when he was a toddler. What memories? Was he in the Wild West with his mother? No, he looked back up at her. "What's your name?" he said to see if he could talk. He had to be cautious, Brad thought. "Serena. You don't remember my name? I always remember names. Everybody says it's a wonder, but if a man passes through town and I meets him at the general store, if he comes back 3 years later, I remembers his name. Always been like that, and lots of people are moving through town, I tell you." "What's the name of the town?" Town don't have a name, don't need one, does it?